Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the latest webinar in the Delta Think News and Views online discussion series. For those of you who've joined us before, welcome back. And for those folks who are new, it's wonderful to have you here. Today, we've got a great session planned for you guys, the evolving value of OhioLink's journal packages in a complex OA landscape, a framework for local resource decisions. I'll be introducing the speakers in just a moment, but first, I'm Heather Staines. I'm a senior consultant at Delta Think and the director of community engagement for the data and analytics tool. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared out to participants when it is ready. We have learned in the pre-meeting time that the chat unfortunately is not working, so I would welcome you to utilize the Q&A, not just for questions, but also for comments. I'll be moderating anything that comes up in there, and we plan for, I think, about 30 minutes of formal presentation today, so that should leave us time afterwards to have some more of an open conversation. So don't be stingy there with your questions and comments. So if we can move on to the next slide, Amy, I'm just going to introduce our speakers briefly. First, you're going to hear from Amy Pawlowski. She's executive director of OhioLink and has, as you can see on the slide, more than 20 years experience working with academic libraries and in library-related private industry. She has been working with library deans and directors on OhioLink's Library Advisory Council and reporting to the Ohio Department of Higher Education, where she's responsible for the organization's vision, directing strategic projects, and leading contract negotiations for electronic resources. Before she was executive director, she spent some time learning her craft as deputy director at OhioLink. Next slide, please, Amy. We're also joined by the associate director, Joanna Voss, who oversees licensing and analytics. She manages collection and data analysis on consortial electronic resources content, open access, as well as OhioLink key performance metrics. She collaborates with the executive director to negotiate those consortial licenses and resource contracts. Next slide, please. We're also joined by Brian Gray. Brian is the Collection Strategies Librarian for the Kelvin Smith Library at Case Western Reserve University, where he oversees the collections budget, manages large-scale projects, and provides leadership between collection management librarians, technical services, and other campus libraries, as well as vendors. He's got a lot of experience working in the space with publishers and vendors. And next slide. Last but absolutely not least, my colleague, Dan Pollock. Dan is Delta Think's Chief Digital Officer. He's based in London, so we're happy that he's able to join us today. And he works with publishing companies to explore and exploit new digital opportunities through his combination of commercial expertise and technical understanding. Over the past 20 years, Dan has specialized in quite a number of digital publishing strategy and product innovation initiatives for companies in both the STM and the legal space. Dan is one of the chief architects and founder for the data and analytics tool. Those of you who have worked with us on that project or joined us for webinars in the past know the value that he will lend to our discussion here today. So I am going to hand over to Amy now to kick off.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Before we dive into the meat of the presentation, I wanted to do a brief introduction to OhioLink. OhioLink is a state organization. We do report up to the Ohio Department of Higher Education. However, we are a true cooperative. So our members, aside from getting some funds from the state, are putting in funds to help our deals move forward in our consortial environment. So we've been doing this for a little over 30 years. If I might not say so, very, very well. The sharing of resources for OhioLink is probably something that our members appreciate and think about on a very high level. The value is there. And as we start talking about OA, today, we're going to cover how we've been thinking about value as it might be shifting from what was traditionally just purchasing subscription content and moving into OA components. So about OhioLink, as I mentioned, we report up to the Ohio Department of Higher Education. We are 117 members, and as you can see, we are a broad spectrum. So we have all of the community colleges, all of the public 4 years, and then the majority of independent college and universities across the state. I think there's maybe only 4 or so institutions, very small institutions that are not members of OhioLink that are private institutions. As you can see, we have, well, I can't tell from the slide, but we have, I think, 5 R1s. We go all the way down to R3s, it kind of in the middle, and then again, some non-research based institutions. So we see all types of uses coming across the membership with our content. Okay, as far as read versus publish institutions, I'm going to have Joanna cover this slide and talk through this a little bit.
Thanks, Amy. So Amy had mentioned that we have a broad spectrum of member institutions in Ohio, like from the big research institutions down to those with more of a teaching-oriented mission and liberal arts colleges. And one of the things that we've seen is this, what we call read and publish institutions. And that simply refers to the fact that we have a few institutions that do a lot of publishing because of their research missions, and then a long tail of the rest of our members that, publish moderately or, occasionally a few articles every other year, something like that. So as we started to think about how we operate in this open access space, I have a link here to the Scholarly Kitchen post from our former executive director, Gwen Evans, from 2019. That's back when we were really starting to think about, like, what does this mean for OhioLink and our existing journal agreements? So what we saw in the data were that we have these few published institutions that publish a lot, and also this long tail of read institutions where primarily they're reading the content, but they do also have some research output as well. So as we started to move into this space, we wanted to very much bear in mind the breadth of that spectrum.
So just really quickly covering OhioLink's strategic framework objectives, which are going through 2025. We have a group called CIRM, which is it's more or less the collection committee. And this group sets the objectives as part of an updated strategic framework to think about OA and how it fits into our resource evaluation. So this is something built into our framework, and the committee is working through and then talking about their findings and how we're going to move forward with our deans and directors. So you'll see the objectives within our framework that the resource committee, the collections committee, has been working through. So making sure the packages align with content needs, taking a look at that open access marketplace for cost neutral open access opportunities. This is a big one. Our members wanted to make sure that we were doing this as pragmatically as possible, given the budget challenges that all of our institutions are facing right now. And then lastly, an objective to define the value of those resources and services and how best to communicate findings to decision makers and influencers. So it's not just deciding what we're doing with open access and how to move forward, but it's also talking about how we communicate and define that value, so we know we're still working to the best of our ability to our members' needs, but also being able to communicate that value so our libraries can communicate that value to university and college administrators. So Joanna, can you cover the intro into open access for OhioLink? Because it's actually been a little longer than you would think.
Right. So, OhioLink's 30 years old. We started to get into our first e-journal agreements in the mid to late 90s. Our first agreements date from about 1998. And really fairly early in that history, we started to dip our toe into open access space. In 2003, we had a Biomed Central agreement to cover part of open access publishing charges for our members. But there wasn't a lot of movement there. In 2014, things started to pick up. OhioLink joined Scope 3 in 2014, where we contribute what would have been subscription funds to making those high energy physics journals open. And as there started, in the wider world, we started to see other events start to change what we were seeing in the open access space. So, early in 2003, the Berlin Declaration, then we had the Holdren Memo in 2013, 2018, Plan S came onto the scene, and then 2022, we were seeing the Nelson Memo with requirements around publicly available publications. And then on the OhioLink's side, again, I mentioned in 2019, we started to look around and say, okay, we're seeing some change here. What does this mean for us? We're kind of moving into the unknown, hence the rocket ship visual metaphor. So we did our first Delta Think analysis in 2019. We saw a pickup in hybrid open access publishing. But we wanted to know what that meant for us. We had this set of journals we were subscribing to. How much of that is hybrid? How is that affecting the value of our packages? Sorry, could you go?
You want me to go back?
Yeah, so could you go back one? And so that's one thing we did to start monitoring our position there. The other thing we did, which we've hinted at in our earlier slide, was we went back to our members and asked them what their priorities were in this space. And of course, cost containment was one of them, but also interest in what this could mean for their institutions and their researchers. So since then, you see the items stack up there. We've continued to do this every other year with Delta Think to look at how this is playing out in the market and for OhioLink's portfolio. We started to step into the open access space ourselves again with our first read and publish agreement starting in 2022. We now have 5. And then continuing with our Delta Think analysis, the most recent in 2023. And now we're starting to see this change pick up. We'll start doing this analysis more frequently annually as well. So continue, Amy, please.
So I jumped a little ahead as Joanna started talking about why we started doing this back in 2019. So it really was trying to take a look at open access publishing and seeing if it was diminishing the value of subscription journals. So also kind of trying to get around the are vendors double dipping? What is happening here? So Joanna, do you have anything to add about that?
I think that covers it. I mean, we have these bullet points because we specifically wanted to get to that idea of how do we measure the value and how does that relate to that proportion of open access in our journals. And doing this with Delta Think let us be quantitative about that.
So some of the findings from 2019, Joanna.
Right. So, this is what, 5 years ago now. Our first analysis, I mentioned we did looking at the proportion of open access in the journals market as a whole, as well as the size of the market over time. We also did that same thing for the journals that we subscribe to as OhioLink. So those would be subscription journals, many of them hybrid. And we did a 5-year snapshot at that point to see what are the trends here. Are we really seeing a decrease in those subscription access articles? What we saw at that point is that we were starting to see a really fast growth in fully gold open access. So those journals that are only open access and charge an APC. We were also still seeing that subscription access content continuing to grow, both in the market as a whole and the OhioLink licensed content. But we were mindful of wanting to continue to monitor that situation at that time. And the hybrid uptake, that's the proportion of articles in hybrid journals that were open, was about 3 to 6% at that point. So at that point, small.
So the biggest takeaway for us, I think, in this analysis was, at the time, if you remember, everyone was talking about the huge growth in open access. And we found that the subscription access content was growing, not as quickly, but it was still growing. So end result is we were not seeing a devaluation of the monies that we were putting towards subscription-based content. And then Joanna, you want to talk about the patterns?
Right. So here's just the snapshot of what that looked like back in 2019. On the left, that's the industry-wide snapshot that Delta Think provided to us. And you can see there the yellow bar is that growth that we were seeing in the fully gold open access. On the right there those were journals subscribed to by OhioLink. The light bluish gray is the proportion that were hybrid. So we were seeing that be fairly low. And of course, we didn't have a lot of fully gold journals in our portfolio. So that is almost absent from that chart as well. So that brings us back to what Amy was saying. We were still seeing that growth in the hybrid at that point.
So it was this point, we had such a positive experience working with Dan on this, and it gave us insight into how the market was changing and moving, and thus a better picture on how to move forward with OhioLink and how we're procuring our content. And do we move into OA, and how quickly do we move into the OA space? So knowing that the market was going to continue to change, we engaged Dan and Delta Think for a second round analysis in 2021. So Joanna, do you want to talk a little bit about this one?
Right. So we envisioned this as a check-in to see, okay, 2 years down the road, how have things changed? So we basically did the same thing, looking at the market and the OhioLink portfolio. We did get better. The underlying data to this that sits on Crossref and on paywall data to look at those proportions of open access. So we again looked at, starting in 2014, those trends through 2020. The other thing that we added in 2021, which is important because we're a consortium of member libraries and working through this as a collective, is we had an open access analysis project team that came out of our collection development committee that thought about how do we measure the value of these things. And I think that's the next slide, but taking that high level view of not just, output in journals, but what other things we can think about. As far as what we got out of the analysis, we were seeing very similar trends. We don't have a graphic for this one, but that continued quick growth in the fully gold open access number of articles. That was continuing to grow quickly across the market, but not much in the OhioLink portfolio by the nature of what that is, a subscription package. That subscription access content was still continuing to grow, so the whole pie was still getting bigger. And that hybrid uptake still fairly low, but 4 to 5%. And we were starting to see the trends for the market as a whole and the subset that OhioLink subscribes to start to diverge. And that we think has a lot to do with, we're working with traditional subscription publishers, and there's also growing fully open access publishers in the market as a whole.
So Joanna mentioned this a little bit about the OA analysis framework.
Yeah, so as I said, I think this is really important because, moving into this new space for libraries and authors and everybody, there's a lot of unknowns. So just putting this into the framework of how we think about them and try to get to answers, I think was really important. So this team of librarians said, okay, we have this sort of traditional analysis and value framework coming out of the subscription world. What do we need to add here? Who are our different stakeholders in this value calculation? So we have our OhioLink member institutions and libraries. So they're still using this research content. They're still reading, and there's still a lot of content behind the paywall that they need. We also now have those authors at those institutions publishing. So this is an opportunity for them to make that research open and readable by anybody in the world in principle. There's, of course, what came out of our 2019 survey is cost. It's very important to have cost containment with these agreements to make sure that's manageable for the libraries and institutions. We also reached out to both our librarians and the publishing authors to get their feedback about what the value of this is for them, and we got largely very positive feedback there. In addition, there's this sort of whole world perspective. So how much is OhioLink's research now being used worldwide? What's the impact there? How do we measure that? If it's through citations or usage or something else. And then again, this Delta Think analysis fitting into this framework in terms of monitoring what the market is doing and how we fit into it.
So it was after this group met and we discussed the findings again, and not surprising, decided that we wanted to run this study again, doing that kind of biennium pattern. So this most recent study that we finished with Delta Think was our 2023 analysis, and a couple things have shifted, Joanna.
Right. So coming back to this in 2023, we're now, a few years into having read and publish agreements in the market, and we were really starting to be curious about how that played out at the publisher level. So one of the things we decided to do at this point, I alluded to earlier, is start to do this more frequently. So doing an annual analysis as opposed to every 2 years, because our hunch is we'll start to see more rapid change. We're also continuing to get better. I say we, but largely Delta Think, our partner in this analysis, is getting better at doing this analysis as we've been through it a few more times and getting better data. As I mentioned, we wanted to look at those sort of publisher level trends here. So we added a layer to this analysis. So we're still doing the whole market. We're still doing the subset of journals that OhioLink subscribes to. But we don't necessarily subscribe to everything from a publisher, and these publishers may be engaging in fully open access journals, and that wasn't captured in our previous work. So that's the level we added. We said, okay, we work with this subset of publishers. What are they doing across their portfolios as a whole, including the fully open access journals, to see what was happening there, if it played out differently between different publisher types with the market and those we worked with.
So as you can gather, I don't think anybody has this fully figured out. We're all still kind of working through how we're going to approach this, both individually and as a community, a consortial community, but also as a publishing community at large. So Joanna, can you talk a little bit about some things we figured out, some things we have answered, but yet that brought about some more questions for us and how we think about this?
Right. So in 2023, again, we were still seeing that really fast growth in the fully open access journals. That's something we expected to see. The subscription output, that overall gray bar, still continuing to grow, but more slowly. And what we're starting to see is that's different depending on if we're looking at specific publishers, which makes sense given that they're engaging in the space in different ways. That overall uptake in hybrid is inching up in recent years. So we suspect we might be starting to see some changes that from these different agreements that have taken place. So we'll be interested to see how that's progressing. Another thing we saw was, in OhioLink's journals that we subscribe to, we've undertaken a few read and publish agreements, and we're starting to see the effect of those publishers doing that in our hybrid uptake in the journals that we subscribe to, which probably is not a surprise either. And we still have some remaining questions. As we said in that framework slide, that there's still a lot of unknown here. So, as we see these proportions shift with the hybrid versus subscription, what does that mean for us? How does that affect pricing? How does that affect the value of these resources across our diverse membership? And how do you assign a value to that? So those are all still open questions.
Dan, do you have anything to add as we move forward with this project?
I don't think so. You covered it very well. We briefly touched on getting better at doing this. So that hints at the underlying data. The underlying data, I think, has continued to improve in the sense that the sources we use have gotten better over the years. And then also we have got more practiced at using it. So I think in the early days, I remember we called out a couple of anomalies in the data and said, is this sort of some trend that's underlying, or is it an anomaly in the data for a particular publisher when we see things shift in an unexpected way? And I think by the time we came to do this again, and then again, we found out that it was the data that sometimes could be a little bit misleading. So I think it's always quite important to keep that context going. And then, yes, I mean, also all good questions is how's the balance shifting between subscription and open access content? And I think you touched on that very important thing. It really does vary by publisher. So, for example, the really, really big market, we might find subscriptions content beginning to reduce very slowly, but that could be, for example, a result of consolidation and a long tail of small publishers moving increasingly open. But when you focus on the big publishers, you may actually find they continue to grow their subscription content along with everything else. So I think your analysis of pulling apart the data and then looking at it through the lens of your particular journal subscriptions and the particular publishers that you're dealing with is very, very important to get to that sense of, so what does this actually mean for us? And separate that out from the broader trends.
Yeah, I think based on the data that Dan pulled together for us, we were able to glean some idiosyncrasies about even how our bigger publishers were stepping into the OA space. Some more conservatively and some, kind of quote unquote jumping into the deep end, right, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Joanna mentioned this. The different publishers are approaching this very differently. So an obvious example is a publisher like Springer Nature, tracing their roots back to Springer. They acquired Biomed Central back in the late noughties. So they were quite early into the open access space. And what we now refer to as transformative agreements, or read and publish, or publish and read, however you want to refer to them. I tend to call them mixed model agreements. They were actually pioneered by Springer back in the mid noughties again, with some very early agreements. So that's an example of one publisher taking a particular path, and then other large publishers are available, of course, and they've all had a different emphasis and a different pace of change. And then I think also they've approached things differently depending on whether they've decided to acquire open access publishers, grow their own in-house open access publishing programs, or approach things a case of, do they want to spin up journals and go down the APC model? And that could be bulk deals, so not just necessarily individual per paper APCs, but a sort of publication fees predicated on volumes of papers. Or do they want to go down a more sponsored journal route, where essentially the whole journal is sponsored by typically some sort of foundation or institution, and then the paywalls are dropped and open licenses are introduced. So you get a whole spread of different approaches, and therefore, yeah, tackling each of the major publishers on a case-by-case basis, I think is quite, from what I've understood from you, has proven very important for you.
Yes, thank you. So as OhioLink, we do work really well together and as a group, and there are a lot of advantages to doing so. However, we do like to make sure that we're bringing value in everything that we do for our members at an individual basis. So today on the call, we have Brian Gray, one of our member librarians and our collection strategists at Case Western, which is a small but very intensive research institution. And we asked Brian to come talk about what does this type of study at a consortial level mean for individual institutions, and does it bring value, and if it does, in what ways?
Thank you, Amy. Just to give a little bit more background, Case Western Reserve University, Cleveland, Ohio, we have 4 campus libraries that do have different reporting lines into the campus community, but we have an open access working group that cuts across all 4 libraries, where we closely monitor the OA landscape. We recommend decisions up through the library leadership at each of the libraries, and we collaborate really closely. So the benefits of this largely fed directly into that group and some of the local efforts. So the idea here is that we had been slow to jump into the OA landscape ourselves because we didn't have a formal university policy or mandate or anything like that. So, and also the OhioLink deals are some of our largest journal deals. So we're not waiting for OhioLink to take actions, but the things we learned from OhioLink have finally allowed us to do some things locally, and that's sort of what I'll share today. But the real benefit of doing this at the consortial level, either the OhioLink decisions that were made, the Delta Think analysis, is we were able to locally dip our toes into the landscape at a very low risk, because we went through all the conversations and all the data at the high level, and we were able to reapply those locally and to some of the analysis and approaches we had, including talking points when we talked to either library leadership, faculty, university administrators, because we'd been through all the conversations and the analysis and the challenges at a much larger scale. And we were able to apply those locally to some of our strategies. Also, the real benefit of doing it at the consortial levels, we're able to react to the trends, I think, a lot quicker, especially with the data that was provided by Delta Think, and we had much better leverage. So the idea that we would need to do it locally, we sort of paused and waited to see how these deals and the analysis would play out. just for those of you that aren't lucky enough to be a member of a consortium like OhioLink, who's done a lot, one of the areas that we were doing locally to really engage with OA is several of us had been on publisher advisory boards, and I had specifically been on one where the publisher was looking to jump into the OA landscape. So I got to learn about like what was a publisher thinking about OA, what was their fiscal approach, what was their long-term timeline, and so if you have that kind of opportunity and you're looking to look at some of these OA transformative deals, republish deals, that would be a great way to really get into the nuts and bolts and be able to largely support your institution's local action with some real concrete examples and background. Amy, next slide, please. I also want to say that it's been a great benefit for CASE to see the larger landscape that the Delta Think study provided, but also then hear how the other OhioLink members, especially through the collection committee efforts, were considering OA ramifications locally. So, what were those benefits that each institution was seeing? And it was not just actually a lot of times it was not just the numbers. There was a lot of other things that were in play. So having those shared conversations and efforts allowed us locally to come up with some strategies and approaches as we started looking at opportunities outside the OhioLink environment, including if there was conversations of a deal that OhioLink was not going to pursue, going through that conversation at the larger scale and then being able to apply it locally, we could jump right in and keep working towards maybe a local deal in those efforts. And also, it made the data and the conversations also made us realize, our approach and our values and sometimes we're not always in direct alignment with OhioLink. So there was deals that, I know from being on the collection committee of OhioLink, that we would have looked at them very differently when it came to what data we looked at or how we approached it. But those numbers or that approach would not have resonated locally as we, had to justify why we were doing putting money into publishing and things like that. In the end, though, it led us to efforts now we're doing locally where we've targeted some smaller mostly STEM societies. We've also signed a couple deals recently with some other publishers that OhioLink is not engaged with. So we were able to take all the process that or the thought process and the data outlines that from the Delta Think analysis, the conversations and decision making that happened at the OhioLink, and just apply it at a local level. So I was able to come back to the open access working group and say, well, here's how, Delta Think spoke to it. Here's how OhioLink talked about it. Does that apply here? Or we need to think about a different audience or a different set of data before we started into the conversations directly with those publishers to possibly work out a deal and come up with a local arrangement.
Thanks, Brian.
Yep.
So a little bit about what's next. Again, as you heard us mention at the top of this presentation, OhioLink is thinking very strategically and honestly pragmatically about how we step into the OA space. So it has to make sense to the entire membership for us to think about moving forward with a publisher that we're engaged with. And that was, again, a clear directive from our deans and directors as we went through and settled our objectives on our strategic framework. So that is what we've been moving towards. In traditional OhioLink style, we never do anything without a deep analysis of how things are moving in the market, how usage is happening, it just a deep dive and really getting to know what is happening before we move into any type of negotiation. So considering the larger changes or the quicker changes happening in the market space. You heard Joanna talk about moving to this analysis to yearly. So we're just getting started with Dan on a next 2024 analysis of the data, and then plan on doing this on a yearly basis until we get into a kind of a comfortable space with understanding how the market is moving. The other thing that we were talking about doing that's still kind of up in the air, we're thinking about this, is an analysis based on subject. So maybe Joanna and Dan can talk a little bit about why we were thinking of this.
Yeah, I'll let Dan take this in a second because I think it was his suggestion when we were talking about preparing for this presentation and like, where else can we go with this? Anecdotally, we hear that there's different levels of uptake in different domains of research, depending on the culture of that, high energy physics versus law, for example. So is there something there we can start thinking about it as well? Dan?
Yeah, what you said that I think that's a good idea. This is one of those slightly chicken and egg things where we might have to look at the patterns in the data to see if there's a there, if that makes sense. But for example, we've observed across the whole market, this is my poster child example, if you look at the amount of open access used in the physical sciences, I think off the top of my mind is about 45% of output, depending on your data set. So that's across physics, physical sciences, but now pull apart some different physics disciplines, and you'll find that high energy physics has got like an 85–90% uptake use of open access, and most of that's in gold journals. Compare and contrast with condensed matter physics, which I think has barely 15% open access, split roughly evenly between gold fully open journals and open access in hybrid. So a real spread of uptake within that one field. And that's why it got me thinking we'll need to work and formulate some questions, but it might be worth just sense checking how this might play out. For example, if you're thinking about different collections, different disciplines, different subject areas, whether or not some further analysis might be worthwhile. Again, and then that means you can start to set numbers in the context. What does it actually mean for you? And your physics faculty may actually need a different market benchmark compared with your chemistry faculty or your arts and humanities people, and so on and so forth. So we thought that there might be some, it might be worthwhile looking into that. But of course, that's all more number crunching and work. But that's one of the ideas we discussed.
Thank you. So that's technically our last slide. So I'll stop sharing. And we can answer questions if there are any.
So just put a reminder that hopefully you guys can see. Apologizing for the disabling of the chat. That was not intentional, I assure you. But please do feel free to use the Q&A. I've got a couple of questions. Oh, let's see. Somebody has jumped in here with a question, and I don't want to just prevent anyone. So Laura Bowering Mullen, curious to your goal in doing various analysis. Is it just to analyze the OA landscape to understand read and/or publishing behavior of members, or do you have other goals, such as a desire to provide greater support for various OA models? Also, do you dovetail with any Delta Think data or initiatives that may be coming out of the work by BTAA, which is the OSU, which through OSU is a member of?
So I'll start, and then Joanna, you might want to jump in here too. The OhioLink is a state agency, and we get state funding to procure this content. So it was extremely important for us over these past years to make sure that we're showing value, and that the content that we're purchasing is still reasonable for the state to invest in. That was the impetus behind us starting this study. There are discussions about how we step into different OA models, but that is not the biggest reason for us doing this study. Again, it's to prove to our members in the state that we're providing value and that we're using our dollars in the right way that brings advantage to all of our members. Joanna, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you covered it, Amy.
So do you dovetail with any Delta Think or data initiatives that might be coming out of work by the BTAA. We have not had discussions with the BTAA, and yes, Ohio State University is a member. Again, our resource committee meets monthly, and we do have representation from Ohio State on that meeting, and we do talk frequently. You know, I think you're kind of pointing at that there's a bigger value for Ohio State, quite honestly, in cutting these types of deals. And yes, that is absolutely true. Ohio State does see a great advantage from these deals. However, any of the OhioLink deals that Ohio State's participating in, they're doing so through OhioLink and not through BTAA. So they have kind of one foot in each camp, right? And we balance that partnership with them very well to make sure that there isn't a double payment or working through different types of initiatives with different goals to attain. I think I got everything right.
Yeah, if I can just jump in for a second, BTAA is also a subscriber to the data and analytics tool. So I haven't had a chance to catch up with Morse very recently. Do try to keep in constant communication, but not maybe in the past 6 months about what they might be doing. But I know we've had some conversations in the past that if there are member institutions that either have questions that they want BTAA to put, you know, to the tool, or if there are member institutions who would like access to it, you know, that's something that we can work on providing. So just reach out either directly to Morris York or come to me, and I'm happy to facilitate conversations there as well. Other attendee questions, because I've got some questions, but I don't want to preempt any questions. Okay, I'm gonna just ask a question. You guys mentioned that you have the OA analysis project team that was put together. And if you can just, you know, tell us a little bit more about, you know, how you decided to put that team together, what types of roles or expertise you wanted to make sure were included there, in case there's anyone else out there that's thinking that they might want to do that. You know, how did that work from your side?
That's a really good question. And actually, Brian was on that team and Joanna drove that team. But I'll start with this and you two can pick it up. It was important that we had representation from different types of OhioLink institutions, right? So the last thing I wanted to do was put a bunch of high intense research institutions on this committee to make decisions about how to move forward with OA, because as a, you know, as a membership, everyone's contributing. So we needed to make sure we talked about value through the entire membership. So the composition of that group was a reflection of OhioLink's broad spectrum of membership. And then Joanna and Brian, maybe you can talk a little bit deeper into the work.
Right. So these were folks that had expertise in collection development and data analysis and some knowledge of the open access space. And actually, in the slides, we referenced a 2021 analysis project team that sort of set out this framework. We've had subsequent project teams to come back and evaluate that framework and see how our various agreements are aligning with that. So we've had another one in 2023 and another this year as well. And we've actually tweaked it a little bit, depending on, you know, how easy it is for us to get information, for example, about usage of OhioLink resources globally. Can we look at citations? Can we dig into the survey aspect a little bit? So this is constantly a work in progress. I don't know, Brian, anything else?
I would just say of the membership, additional to what Amy and Joanna outlined, of making sure we had, you know, everyone from like the high research to people that are maybe just publishing a few articles a year. We also wanted that combine have membership among that had maybe different local policies or procedures, either mandates or requirements, so we could make sure that those that did have had already jumped into that space and had local things they needed to meet or proceed with, they were represented in the conversations. And it also allowed us to look at the data in different perspectives. So then each member of that committee was thinking about, like, if we were doing it on our campus, like who on our campus would we be able to speak to this data, or who would we present it, or how would we present it? So, there was people that were thinking about more of the faculty, some were thinking more about the library administrators, some were thinking about their provost or their senior financial officer who's going to question why all of a sudden money's going into a different pipeline than traditional content. So the committee had seemed to have all those perspectives well covered, bring it back, share them, discuss them, and that fed it into the consortial decisions and process.
Great, thank you so much. I had another question about, this one's about the framework. And one of the reasons we thought it was really important to present this today was that this framework, we hope, is going to be more broadly applicable. And the sort of the three parts of the framework, the institutional threads you're bringing together, the author input from the survey, but then the third part was really the global whole world piece. So why was that important for you guys to consider as part of the framework?
So we like to give our members as much autonomy as we can, but trying to work together in the best way possible. And there are some institutions in Ohio that are really thinking about raising their profile. And quite honestly, open access is, I shouldn't say an easy way, but what seems like a smart way to help raise profile, higher citations, broader reading happening with those types of, with that type of content. So when we talk about global representation, it really is making sure that our members are getting out of the membership what they feel they need, whether they be high research and are trying to raise their profile, or even, we do have some liberal arts institutions that are very much trying to do the same thing, but just in a very different way. So bringing those all together and talking about that on a global level seemed extremely important.
And Amy, I'll add that having that as part of the framework lets us go back to publishers who are, we're all still relatively new to these transformative read and publish agreements and say, this is an element that's really important to our members. How can you help us facilitate getting this information about that global impact?
Yeah, anything, Brian, that you wanted to add, or?
I would say it also helped us to monitor and keep aware of some of the movement, especially in like Europe and areas like that, where they were a little farther ahead in some of these conversations and processes. So we were closely monitoring that, keeping that in the back of our mind, being able to learn from either their successes or mistakes and being able to apply those, from, Ohio.
Yeah, it's that perspective. We talk about this a lot at OhioLink, and maybe I'm taking for granted that most people do this, but how Europe is approaching OA and how the US is approaching OA, or quite honestly is very, very different. And we've been talking about this as a community over the last few years. I don't think we have any really good answers yet. So keeping track of what's happening globally in the OA space and how people are moving forward is really important and can lend itself to help us in the US think about how to approach moving this forward if it has value.
Yeah, and Dan, maybe I can ask you to weigh in a little bit. I know that we've been spending more time with the data in the analytics tool, pulling in global and regional data. Maybe you could talk to that just briefly.
Yeah, it's excuse me. I mean, again, this is all about context, isn't it? We've as we've worked with this data over the years, we're trying to put it apart maybe in a couple of dimensions. I mean, one is just measuring the stuff that we see. So that's very much dependent on the quality of the data source. And we find sometimes there can be problems there when, especially trying to tease out peer-reviewed stuff from non-peer-reviewed stuff. Some of the data sources we use just can't do that very well or reliably because they can't get behind paywalls to analyze it. So we also look at trends as well. And try and figure out, is there a long tail of content that's maybe of very little value that might create noise, or how do we get rid of variations from one year to the next? Because we find that content tends to come in fits and starts. So there's a number of things we can do at the global level just to sort of smooth out the bumps in the chart. which I think is quite important when you're trying to take decisions and analyze where the market's going. You don't want to be thrown out by headlines of big swings each year that might then cancel each other out the following year. And then, yes, also just breaking this out by subject, by country of authorship. That could prove quite challenging as well. We also are beginning to pull apart society and non-society journals. I think that's quite an interesting thing as well. That's another way of pulling apart the information. And we're beginning to find that there are quite noticeably different patterns in society-owned journals compared with other sorts of journals. So yeah, I mean, there's various ways we can dice and slice things depending on the sort of questions that we want to answer.
Yeah, you mentioned the quality of the data, Dan, and again on the framework, you guys mentioned that you look at the publications, the author output, by members. I suppose that, given the various, differences in resource availability and different size of members, that their ability to get that data on their authors and their researchers as authors, is challenging. I've presented, on it before. Charleston, there's no sort of one way to indicate a corresponding author. Sometimes institutions collaboration groups may look around to see whose institution has an agreement and, designate that person. But how did you kind of get at that with your members, or did you kind of take it as you'd have to be able to work with, what you could get your hands on, or how did that work?
Yeah, so we didn't rely on any self-reporting from our membership. Joanna can talk about the data gathering at that point. And here's the reason why. Joanna and Brian, you'll remember this meeting. It was early on, maybe 2019. It was pre-pandemic, and we were talking about OA and how to step into the space. And I asked a question at our resource committee, which has representation from all charters, so all public 4 years, as well as 3 from independent institutions and 3 from 2 years, and then law and med. I asked the question of who has an office on campus that is tracking your faculty's publishing, and maybe half raised their hands. And then as we were talking about this, you layer on top the different levels of how an institution is tracking the work of their authors. And it varies from institution to institution. So very quickly, we realized that if we were going to try to get a hold of OhioLink's data in this space, that self-reporting by institution probably was not the way to go. So Joanna, I'll let you take it from here.
Right. So where we end up normally is getting data directly from publishers, and that analysis project team, they also go out and double check against other sources like Web of Science and Scopus to make sure we have a sanity check around that accurate count of output, because this is definitely an area where some consistency and improvement would be needed.
So really good question, Heather. And this is something that we think about on a regular basis, right? It's that trust but verify. We're getting that information from the publishers, but we need to make sure that what we're getting is correct. And for the most part, it is. Sometimes we'll find some anomalies. And again, I've mentioned some idiosyncrasies about listing institutions and that we work through, but nothing has been crazy and outlandish as far as the data that we're getting from publishers.
Yeah, and just to kind of highlight on this again, like this is a really challenging issue that we really need to collaborate, and work on together, because in some instances, different types of publications require APCs or have no APCs, and publishers may have 10, 12, 20 different types of publications across all their journals, or have different ways of designating things. And so it's one of those things that we continue to push on in the space. And I do a lot of industry initiatives, and I think it's far from being solved. I don't see any more questions coming in, but if questions occur to you guys later, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. I do want to thank again our speakers for joining us today. It's been really informative for me. And the recording will be distributed in the next couple of days. You'll receive a link via email. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. I will be at the NASIG conference in a couple of weeks. And I suspect some of you folks may be there as well. Charleston Call for Proposals is open. It's going to be an exciting rest of the year. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate any feedback you would like to provide. And we'll look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.